I've covered several supergroups on my channel, but there are more recent ones like Velvet Revolver and Audioslave. But in today's video, I want to talk about truly one of the most talented supergroups of all time. In fact, if anything, their attitude was that of an anti-supergroup. I'm of course talking about the Traveling Wilburys, a group that was largely put together by chance. The origins of the band begin with ex-Beatle George Harrison, who in 1987 would release his seventh studio record, Cloud 9. Harrison, feeling disillusioned with the state of the music industry, had mostly, minus the odd soundtrack or charity songs, had taken the past 5 years off and pursued other interests, including his film production company, Handmade Films. But by 1986, Harrison felt like it was time to make music again. He would enlist ELO leader and producer Jeff Lynne to co-produce his seventh studio album. Cloud 9 would include several songs that would show up in the film Shanghai Surprise, which was produced by his company, and Harrison would even appear in the film himself. With recording beginning in January of '87, it was a few months into these sessions that Harrison and Lynne discussed the possibility of putting a band together, with each of them picking one artist they'd like to have in the group. Harrison chose Bob Dylan, while Lynne chose Roy Orbison. With production finishing up in August of '87 on Cloud 9, the record would be released about 4 months later in November. The first single, Got My Mind Set on You, would top the Billboard Hot 100 chart. The second single, When We Was Fab, would peak at number 23. The album would end up going platinum, and it was Harrison's label, Warner Brothers Records International, who would request that the ex-Beatle record a B-side for a European release of the third single, This Is Love. It was now early 1988, the album had been out for a few months, and Harrison was having dinner one night with Jeff Lynne and Roy Orbison in Los Angeles. Lynne at the time was producing Orbison's album Mystery Girl. Harrison brought up that his label wanted him to do a B-side for his third single, and he was intending on going to the studio the next day to come up with a song. The story goes that Lynne agreed to work on the track, and Orbison said he wanted to come watch. Harrison, who was also friends with Tom Petty, had left his guitar at the musician's house, and when he went to retrieve it, asked the lead heartbreaker to join in on the track as well, which he agreed to do. I do want to point out that Tom Petty told a slightly different version of events, telling Classic Rock that it would be Jeff Lynne who called up Tom Petty, telling him that they were working with Roy Orbison in the studio and that he should come down. According to the Associated Press, the problem was that all the nearby recording studios were booked, so they needed to get someone else who had a recording studio at their disposal. Bob Dylan just happened to have a recording studio in his garage, with Harrison recalling, "I phone up Bob and sometimes you can call him and not get through for years, but he picked up the first ring and said, sure, come on over." Orbison, for his part, only heard the other musicians referring to Dylan as Bob, with him remarking to Rolling Stone, "I didn't know who Bob was. Turned out to be Bob Dylan." Lynne and Harrison had hung out with Tom Petty dating back to his 1987 tour with the Heartbreakers, and he had met Bob Dylan a few times, but never met his idol Roy Orbison. Harrison knew Roy Orbison since he toured with the Beatles back in the 60s, while Harrison and Dylan had met each other numerous times, with their first meeting happening in the 60s. By the time Harrison showed up to Dylan's house in Malibu, he had a really early version of the B-side with the chord sequence completed. Harrison would claim to a Dutch interviewer that he had written part of the song for Roy Orbison to sing, since he thought it was silly to have Orbison sitting there and not appear on the track. Upon showing up to Dylan's house, the musicians would throw around different ideas, with the process coming together really easy and quickly. When it came time to come up with a name for the song, which the lyrics would be built around, Harrison noticed a box in Dylan's garage that read, "Handle with care." Upon completing the song, Mo Austin at Harrison's label would recall, a couple days later, George came by my office to play the new B-side. George played us Handle with Care. Our reaction was immediate. This was a song we knew could not be wasted on some B-side. Lenny and I stumbled over each other's words, asking, can't we somehow turn this into an album? I also had a suspicion that perhaps George had been hungering for another band experience. Harrison would first make mention of the project in February of 1988, while appearing on the legendary show Rockline with Bob Coburn.
But what I'd really like to do next is, not particularly my own album, is to do an album with me and some of my mates. And that way, we could do something which would be different and would be a one-off thing, but I would only do it if we made it good. I wouldn't just do it like as some sort of daft thing. I'd like to do Old Rockin' Chair, sing a song like Old Rockin' Chair with Eric Clapton. And, a few tunes, maybe the Traveling Wilburys. This is this new group I got. It's called the Traveling Wilburys. And I'd like to do an album with them. And then later, we can all do our own albums again.
Due to the musicians' busy schedules, most notably Bob Dylan being on tour, they carved out a 10-day time frame to record an additional 9 songs at the home studio of the Eurythmics' Dave Stewart. Lynne would talk about a typical day in the recording studio, telling the interviewer, "We would arrive about 12 or 1 o'clock and have some coffee. Somebody would say, 'What about this?' and start on a riff. Then we'd all join in and it'd turn into something. We'd finish around midnight and just sit for a bit while Roy would tell us fabulous stories about Sun Records or hang out with Elvis. Then we'd come back the next day to work on another one." Due to George Harrison being responsible for putting the band together, he'd be appointed the de facto leader. They would call themselves Traveling Wilburys. The story for a long time was that Wilburys was a term that Harrison and Lynne used to describe faulty studio equipment like equalizers and knobs. To deal with this issue, Harrison would remark, "We'll bury him in the mix." And Harrison initially proposed the name Trembling Wilburys, with Lynne responding the Traveling Wilburys. Now fast forward to 2018 and Lynne shed some light on the name, calling it a fabrication, telling the interviewer, "That's a total fabrication. Someone invented that just to make it sound good." Then Tom Petty and George Harrison gave a different account of how the band's name came to be. So in 1988, the Associated Press would write the one article on the band that was printed in hundreds of newspapers. In that article, Petty would tell the Associated Press that the group's name came from Prince Charles. Harrison and Lynne would perform at the Prince's Trust concert in 1987, with Petty claiming that Prince Charles complimented the two musicians and told them that they should form a group called the Traveling Wilburys. Harrison would confirm this story while doing press for the band's first release. Now, like any supergroup, ego always comes into play, and for the band, the plan was to put all that aside. Everyone would contribute to writing as well as singing. Petty described how the band cleared the air with Bob Dylan from the day they went into a studio, recalling what Harrison said to Dylan, stating, "We know that you're Bob Dylan and everything, but we're going to just treat you and talk to you like we would anybody else." Dylan supposedly replied, "Well, great, believe it or not, I'm in awe of you guys, and it's the same for me." And that mutual respect would be vital to their chemistry and working relationship. All the songwriting credits would list the Traveling Wilburys. Hell, they didn't even use their real names, instead concocting a whimsical family history dating back to the 6th century, with each member adopting a pseudonym. Each of the 5 Wilburys was born to a different wife of the same father, Charles Truscott Wilbury Sr., a notorious drinker and womanizer. Harrison became Nelson, Lynne was Otis, Orbison was Lefty, honoring his musical hero Lefty Frizzell. Dylan would be known as Lucky, and Petty was Charlie T. Petty would tell Classic Rock magazine that his nickname on the 1987 Heartbreakers tour was Charlie T towards the end of it. Petty would tell the Berkshire Eagle, "We definitely don't want to treat it like a supergroup. I don't even like the term that much at all, but we were aware that it would be viewed as such. We look at the Wilburys as completely other persona than ourselves. If we had planned it, it probably would not have worked because of all the business complications. But once it was rolling, no one wanted to stop it." Harrison would echo these sentiments, telling Countdown that he disliked supergroups in the 70s who used their actual names, thinking that because you had all these big-name musicians in the same band, that the music was going to automatically be good. Harrison would admit that a lot of the times those records would be terrible. Released in October of '88, the album was a surprise hit, winning rave reviews, peaking at number 3 on the album chart in America, going on to sell 3 million copies. The lead single, Handle with Care, would peak at number 45 on the Hot 100 chart. The second single, End of the Line, would peak at number 63 on the same chart. There would also be a promotional single that also charted in Heading for the Light, which would peak at number 7 on the mainstream rock chart. Interestingly enough, the South Florida Sentinel would claim that some radio stations viewed Roy Orbison's voice as a liability, and so they opted not to play the lead single Handle with Care. Whether the band would travel or tour would frequently come up in interviews for their first album, with Petty telling the LA Times, "My problem is I would rather be out in the audience watching these guys than on stage." Despite their name, the band would never tour, and perhaps part of the reason had to do with their busy schedules as well. Funny enough, the band would help revive the careers of Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, and Tom Petty. Lynne would go on to produce Tom Petty's debut solo record, 1989's Full Moon Fever, which featured 3 #1 hits on the rock charts, including Free Fallin', Runnin' Down a Dream, and I Won't Back Down. The album would end up going 5 times platinum. The same year, Dylan would release Oh Mercy, which became his best-selling record in many years and would be hailed by critics as a comeback album. Nearly 2 months after Traveling Wilburys' debut album came out, and while the record was in the top 10, Roy Orbison would pass away due to a heart attack at the age of 52. Orbison would pass away before the band recorded the video for their second single, End of the Line.
Let's talk about Roy for a minute. When Roy died, did you guys think about how you wanted to proceed with the band?
We never considered Roy replaceable. We never looked for a replacement.
When it came to the time when somebody said, let's do another one, you know, Roy had been missing for 2 years, so, you know, we just did it without him.
And it just felt natural to go ahead with the 4 of us.
Roy Orbison's subsequent release, 1989's Mystery Girl, was bolstered, of course, by the popularity of Traveling Wilburys, as well as the single You Got It, which was a top 40 hit and would be co-written by Petty and Lynne. The band would return in 1990 with their final release, Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. Petty would joke in one interview that typically sophomore releases see the band under so much pressure to repeat the success of their first record that the band wanted to skip that and go straight to Volume 3. Lynne would tell USA Today, "That was George's idea. He said, let's confuse the buggers." The members would change their monikers under the Wilbury surname for their second release. Their second release would be less positively received, but it was still pretty successful, going platinum. The final track on the album and the second single, Wilbury Twist, would feature a star-studded lineup of cameos by the late great John Candy, Woody Harrelson, and Whoopi Goldberg, to name a few. Sadly, Harrison and Petty would pass away in the subsequent years, leaving Lynne and Dylan as the surviving members of the band. In 2007, a retrospective box set was released, with it hitting #1 in 6 territories and peaking at #9 in America. The box set would hold the record for the highest debut for a box set in the States and the biggest first week sales for a box set in the UK upon its release. That does it for today's video, guys, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.